The crowd stood restless that evening, dust swirling through the small town square. It wasn't the kind of place where anything new happened. Just an old wooden stage, men in worn boots, and a strange silence hanging in the air. But today there was something different. A woman stood on the platform, her head covered by a rough brown sack. No one knew her face, her name, or where she had come from. People whispered and laughed, wondering why anyone would bother bidding for her. The auctioneer's voice echoed, calling out numbers that no one answered. $1, he shouted, but the crowd stayed quiet. No one moved. The air felt thick with curiosity and unease. Then from the back of the crowd, a voice spoke up, calm, deep, almost hesitant. $2. The sound made heads turn. It came from a man who rarely spoke to anyone, a lumberjack. He stood tall, covered in the dust of work, his clothes rough from the forest. People knew him, the man who lived alone in a cabin beyond the river, who spent his days cutting wood and his nights by the fire with no one to talk to. They called him quiet, maybe even strange, but not cruel. So when he raised his hand with two crumpled dollars, no one laughed at first. Then the murmurs began. $2 for her, someone whispered. Another chuckled. He must be out of his mind. The auctioneer looked surprised but nodded. No one else bid. The hammer came down and the deal was done. Just like that, the woman with the sack over her head belonged to the man who spoke the fewest words in town. He didn't say much as he walked toward the stage. He didn't smile or stare. He simply took her hand and helped her down gently, like she was made of something fragile. The crowd watched in silence, unsure what to make of it. The woman said nothing. Her face stayed hidden, her hands trembling beneath the cloth. Together they walked away, their footsteps fading into the sound of wind and gravel. No one followed them. No one dared to ask why. But everyone who saw it that day would remember the moment the lonely lumberjack paid $2 for the woman no one else wanted, the woman who didn't even show her face. The cabin stood deep in the woods, far from the noise of town. Pines surrounded it on every side, tall and dark, whispering whenever the wind passed through. Smoke rose from the chimney most evenings, thin and gray against the fading sky. Inside, a single man lived alone, the lumberjack. His name was Samuel. Most people in town barely remembered that name because he rarely spoke it, and no one ever came close enough to ask. He woke before dawn every day, chopping trees until his arms ached. The forest was his company. The sound of the axe, the crack of falling timber, and the call of distant crows filled the long hours. When night came, he sat by a small fire, the flames flickering against the walls, eating bread and beans in silence. Sometimes he'd hum a tune he couldn't remember the words to. Other times he'd stare at the window, watching the snow fall, wondering how a man could feel so empty in a world so full of sound. People in town said he chose that life, that he liked being alone, but they were wrong. Loneliness wasn't a choice, it was a shadow that followed him everywhere. He had tried once to start a family, years ago before the hard winters took everything he had built. His wife had left after losing their only child. Since then, Samuel stopped looking for joy. He didn't go to church anymore. He didn't visit neighbors. The forest became his only home. When the auction was announced in town, he wasn't planning to go. He heard about it by accident, two men at the supply store talking about a group of women being brought in. Workers, or companions, people said. It wasn't right, he thought. People shouldn't be sold. But the thought lingered anyway. Not the auction itself, but the idea of company, a voice in the house, someone to talk to, even a stranger. That evening, he found himself walking down the dirt road toward the square. He told himself he was just curious, just looking. But part of him knew that wasn't true. He wanted to feel something again, even if it was small. When he arrived, the crowd was already there, faces half hidden under hats, eyes fixed on the stage. The air smelled like sweat, dust, and cheap whiskey. Laughter came in bursts, mean and sharp. Then the woman stepped out. She was different from the others. Covered completely, her head wrapped in a rough sack that hung loosely around her neck. No one could see her eyes or her hair. She stood still, silent, almost like she wasn't really there. The auctioneer shouted for bids, but no one raised a hand. A few men laughed. One tossed a coin and missed. Someone said, "Maybe she's cursed." Another shouted, "Maybe she ain't got a face under there." Samuel watched. The woman didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood like a statue. There was something about that stillness, not fear exactly, but something close. The crowd's laughter grew louder, crueler. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he tried again. $1, anyone, 50 cents, still nothing. Samuel didn't think. He just spoke, $2. The words left his mouth before he realized what he'd done. Heads turned, the laughter stopped. The auctioneer blinked. $2, he repeated, surprised. Samuel nodded once. The man shrugged and brought the hammer down. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet air. For a second, Samuel almost regretted it. Not because of the money, but because of the eyes staring at him. But then he looked up at the woman again, at how small her hands looked against the rough rope that tied them, and something inside him steadied. He walked forward, paid the money, and untied the rope himself. The woman didn't look at him, didn't speak, but she followed when he turned toward the road. The walk home was long. The night grew colder with every mile. Neither of them said a word. Samuel could hear her footsteps behind him, light but steady. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, he lit a lamp and pushed the door open. "You can rest," he said softly, motioning toward a chair by the fire. She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her hands shook slightly as she sat. He placed a bowl of stew in front of her. She didn't touch it at first, just kept her head low. He didn't ask her to remove the sack. He didn't ask her name. Something told him not to. He went about his routine like always, chopped wood, fixed tools, cleaned the cabin, but now there was another sound inside those walls. Breathing that wasn't his. It was strange at first, but not unpleasant. When he cooked, he made enough for two. When he went to fetch water, he left a cup ready on the table. She rarely moved or spoke, but she listened. He could feel her eyes through the cloth sometimes, following him quietly. Days passed. The forest grew colder, the nights longer. He wondered who she was, what she hid from, why she stayed silent. But each time the questions came, he pushed them away. Maybe she needed time. Maybe she had suffered more than he could imagine. So he waited. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, the flames dancing across the floorboards. The woman would sit across from him, hands folded in her lap, the cloth still covering her head. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, yes, but it was shared. Sometimes Samuel would think back to the moment at the auction, to the laughter of the crowd, to the strange pull that made him raise his hand. He didn't know why he had done it then. But as the days passed, and as the quiet in his cabin began to change, he started to feel something he hadn't in years, a flicker of warmth he couldn't explain. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something simpler. A sense that, maybe, loneliness didn't have to last forever. Morning came with a slow gray light spilling through the cracks in the window. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only faint orange embers glowing in the hearth. Samuel stirred awake in his chair, his neck stiff from sleeping upright. Across the room, the woman still sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her head bowed beneath the rough sack. She hadn't moved much since they arrived. For a moment, he wondered if she had slept at all. He stood quietly, trying not to startle her, and set a kettle of water to boil. The sound of crackling wood filled the silence between them. Outside, the forest was waking, crows calling from high branches, the creak of frozen trees, the far-off rush of a stream beneath thin ice. Samuel poured 2 tin cups of coffee and set one near her on the small table. "You can drink," he said softly. "It's not much, but it'll warm you." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. The sack moved as she tilted her head, but she didn't speak. He noticed how careful she was, every motion small, deliberate, almost frightened. When she finished, she placed the cup down gently and folded her hands again. Days turned into weeks, and though she never spoke, the rhythm of their lives began to change. Samuel went to work in the forest each morning, and when he returned, He would find the cabin swept clean, the tools neatly stacked by the wall and food simmering on the fire. He never asked her to do any of it, but she did. Each small act told him she wanted to help, or maybe it was her way of saying thank you without words. One afternoon, as he returned from cutting wood, he saw her outside for the first time. She stood near the fence, her head still covered, her hands brushing snow off the logs. The sight stopped him. For a moment she looked almost free, the pale light glinting off the rough cloth, the shape of her shoulders delicate against the cold wind. But when she sensed him watching, she froze. Then she turned and walked quickly back inside. He didn't follow her. He just set down his axe and whispered, "You don't have to hide here." That night, when the fire burned low again, he spoke while sharpening his blade, not looking directly at her. "You can stay as long as you want," he said. "You're safe here." She didn't answer, but her breathing changed, quicker, uneven, and for the first time he thought he heard her make a faint sound, like a sigh caught between relief and fear. Samuel wasn't a man of many words, but he found himself talking more than usual. He spoke about the forest, how it sounded different when snow fell heavy, how trees groaned before they split. He told stories about the storms that used to scare him as a boy, about his mother's bread that always smelled like smoke. He wasn't sure if she listened, but sometimes, when he stopped talking, she would shift slightly, like she wanted him to keep going. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow pressed hard against the windows, he noticed something small. She had begun humming. It was faint, almost hidden under the sound of the storm. A soft tune, slow, trembling like a memory trying to return. Samuel froze, the knife still in his hand, listening. The melody was unfamiliar, yet it felt like it belonged there in that quiet cabin in the woods. He didn't say a word. He just let her hum. Over the following days, she began leaving tiny signs of herself around the house. A flower made of twine on the table, a piece of folded paper near the window. She still didn't talk, but her silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of waiting for trust, maybe, or courage. One morning, Samuel returned from town with a new blanket and some flour. The shopkeeper had asked if he was still living alone. He'd lied and said yes. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he couldn't explain what was happening, because he didn't understand it himself. When he entered the cabin, the fire was out, but the room smelled like bread. Fresh, warm bread. He blinked, surprised. The woman stood near the table, her hands dusted with flour. She didn't turn toward him, but her movements were calm, almost confident now. He wanted to say something, thank you maybe, but the words caught in his throat. Later, while they ate in silence, he caught himself wondering about her face. Was she young? Was she old? Was she hurt beneath that sack? The thought made him uneasy, and he forced himself to look away. He had promised himself not to pry. But curiosity, quiet and persistent, began to grow stronger each day. That night, after he'd banked the fire, he noticed she had placed something near his chair, a wooden comb, carved from pine. He lifted it carefully, turning it in his hand. The edges were smooth, sanded with care. A gift, he thought. Simple, but it meant something. He looked toward her. She sat on her cot, still covered, hands folded in her lap. For the first time he smiled, a small, tired smile that reached his eyes. "I don't know your name," he said quietly. "But thank you." Her head turned slightly in his direction. She didn't move otherwise, didn't speak. But the air between them shifted. Something invisible, something gentle, filled the space. Outside, the snow kept falling, wrapping the world in silence. Inside, two people sat across from each other, strangers, yet no longer alone. Samuel stayed awake long after she had gone still, listening to the crackle of the fire. He thought of how she had stood on that stage weeks ago, faceless and voiceless, mocked by men who never saw her as human. He thought of how easily he could have walked away, how simple it would have been to stay alone. But he hadn't. And now, for reasons he couldn't name, that cabin in the middle of nowhere didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Winter deepened and the forest turned white. The snow came heavy, thick enough to cover the path to town. Samuel didn't mind being trapped. The cabin had warmth now, not just from the fire, but from something gentler that he couldn't explain. The woman still wore the sack over her head, yet her presence no longer felt strange. It had become part of the rhythm of the place. She moved quietly through the cabin, tending to chores, humming her soft, wordless tune. Every morning Samuel woke to the smell of bread or stew. She never ate before him, always waiting until he'd taken his first bite. He tried to change that once, pushing the bowl toward her, saying, "We can eat together." But she shook her head and stayed still. He didn't insist. He had learned patience from the trees, how long they stood before breaking, how silence could mean endurance, not emptiness. The days passed quietly. The snow piled higher outside, covering the woodpile, the fence, even the path to the creek. The cabin grew dimmer as frost crept across the window panes. Inside, time seemed slower, stretched between the steady rhythm of her movements and the sound of the fire breathing in the hearth. Samuel worked indoors now, mending tools and carving handles. She sat nearby, sometimes sewing, sometimes still, her face hidden as always. One night the wind howled so fiercely it shook the roof. Samuel rose from bed and checked the door, making sure it was latched tight. He noticed the woman standing near the window, her shoulders tense beneath the blanket she wore. He moved closer quietly so she wouldn't startle. "It's just the wind," he said. "It can't hurt us." She didn't turn to face him, but he saw her nod. For the first time she reached out, her hand resting on the windowsill, pale fingers trembling. Something inside Samuel softened. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to be afraid, that no one would harm her here. But words felt too heavy for that moment. Instead, he brought another log to the fire, letting its light fill the room. The storm raged outside, but the warmth between them felt like a fragile shield against the dark. When morning came, the world was silent again. The storm had buried everything. Samuel opened the door to find snow stacked almost to his knees. As he shoveled a narrow path, he noticed her watching from the doorway. Her covered face turned toward the light for the first time, and he could see the faint shape of her mouth moving beneath the cloth, not speaking, but almost smiling. That small moment stayed with him all day. Later, when he returned from the woodshed with fresh logs, he found her sitting by the fire with something in her lap, a small piece of cloth, folded and stitched with delicate care. It looked like a pouch, simple but finely made. She turned it over in her hands and held it out to him. He hesitated, then took it gently. "Did you make this?" he asked. She nodded. He opened it and found a tiny wooden carving inside, a bird, wings spread wide. He felt a lump in his throat. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." Her hands trembled slightly before returning to her lap. For the first time he noticed the way her fingers fidgeted when she grew nervous, twisting the edge of her sleeve, pressing against her palms. He wondered what her life had been before the auction. Who had made her hide her face? What kind of pain could make a person bury their own name? That night, he lay awake long after the fire had dimmed. The quiet between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was a pause between words unspoken. He wanted to ask her everything, where she came from, what she feared, what her name was. But he also feared breaking the fragile peace they had built. So he waited, the way one waits for spring, not certain when it will come, but believing it will. Days melted into one another. The snow outside turned crusted and hard. The woman began stepping out again, gathering wood, sweeping the porch, feeding the birds that perched nearby. Samuel would watch her through the window, careful not to disturb her. She moved slower now, less afraid of being seen. Still she kept the sack on. It wasn't shame, he realized. It was protection. One afternoon he heard her humming that same soft tune again. This time he recognized the pattern, an old lullaby his mother used to sing. He froze in the doorway, listening. The melody carried through the room, light and trembling like something fragile being reborn. When she noticed him standing there, she stopped instantly, pulling the cloth tighter around her head. "It's all right," he said gently. "It's a good song." For the first time she made a sound in reply. Not words, just a faint a tone shaped like a response. He smiled, not pressing further. That tiny sound felt like the first crack of sunlight after a long storm. In the evenings, Samuel sometimes caught her staring at the fire. Once, he thought he heard her whisper something, but the words were too soft to catch. It didn't matter. He didn't need to understand yet. One night, as they sat in the quiet glow of the flames, she reached for a log and dropped it by accident. The noise startled her, and she stepped back quickly, her hand brushing the edge of the table. Samuel stood and caught it before it fell. Their hands met for a second, warm, rough, alive. She froze. He didn't move either. That moment stretched long, as if the world had paused around them. Then she pulled her hand away and turned toward the fire, her shoulders shaking slightly. Samuel said nothing. He just sat down again, his chest heavy but calm. He understood now, fear doesn't vanish when kindness arrives. It learns how to breathe again. That night before the fire went out, he placed the small carved bird she had given him on the mantel. He didn't know if she saw it. But the next morning when he woke, he found another carving beside it, a tiny heart, smooth and unfinished, placed gently next to the bird. For a long time he stared at it, unsure what to feel. There were no words written, no message left behind. But something inside him stirred, a quiet knowing that trust was growing, even if love was still too shy to speak. Outside, the snow began to melt. Small patches of earth appeared beneath the trees. The sound of dripping water echoed through the forest. The world was changing, slowly, silently, just like the two souls in that lonely cabin. The first hints of spring came softly, almost without notice. The air no longer bit at Samuel's lungs when he stepped outside. The snow, once high enough to trap him in, had begun to melt into gray slush that soaked the earth beneath his boots. Birds returned, cautious at first, then louder, filling the mornings with sound. For months, the forest had been silent except for the swing of his axe and the whisper of fire. Now, life had come back. And with it came a restlessness he didn't understand. The woman still wore the sack, though the heaviness around her had changed. She moved with more certainty now, her hands surer, her steps steady. When Samuel came home from the woods, she sometimes stood outside waiting, pretending to sweep the porch even when there was nothing left to sweep. Once he caught her looking at the sunset, the light catching the edges of the rough fabric that covered her head. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break whatever small piece of peace she had found in that quiet moment. Inside, their days carried a rhythm that felt almost like a life shared. He chopped wood. She cooked and mended. They sat across from each other at night, the silence between them no longer sharp but soft, like a blanket that kept the cold out. And sometimes she would hum, not always the same tune, but always low and tender, as if the songs were meant for no one to hear but the walls. Samuel had stopped counting the days since the auction. It didn't matter anymore. She wasn't just a stranger he'd brought home. She was part of the place now, part of the stillness, the warmth, the small routines that made each day feel like something worth keeping. But the questions that once lingered quietly in the back of his mind began to press forward. Who was she? What had happened to her? What did she hide behind that sack? He told himself it didn't matter. That kindness didn't need answers. But he couldn't stop wondering. One evening, after working late in the forest, he came home to find her sitting by the fire, the room lit only by its faint orange glow. The smell of stew filled the air. She didn't move when he entered, only lifted her head slightly as he set down his tools. There was something different in the way she sat, still, but not tense. Her hands rested in her lap, and when he looked closer, he saw that she was holding something. The small wooden bird he had placed on the mantel weeks ago. "You like that one?" he asked softly. She didn't nod or shake her head. Instead, she placed it gently on the table beside her. Then, to his surprise, she spoke. Her voice came out hoarse, cracked from months, maybe years of silence. "I carved it," she said. The words were barely a whisper, but they hit him like thunder. For a moment, he didn't move. He wasn't even sure he'd heard right. The sound of her voice felt fragile, like if he reacted too quickly, it might break apart. He swallowed hard, afraid to frighten her back into silence. "You carved it?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. Her voice trembled again when she spoke next. "My father taught me before everything." He didn't ask what everything meant. He just nodded, his chest tight. The way she said the word told him enough. There was pain in it, old and heavy. The room stayed still. He wanted to ask her name but didn't. He waited. She looked toward the fire, the flames dancing over the rough fabric that still covered her head. Then slowly, with shaking hands, she reached up. Samuel didn't breathe. He didn't dare. Her fingers found the edge of the sack. For a long time she didn't move further, just held it there. Then she pulled it off. The cloth fell into her lap, soft and silent. Samuel's throat tightened. Her face was pale and thin, framed by tangled hair that caught the light like copper. A long scar curved from her jaw to her neck, old, faded, but deep. Her eyes were green, wide and cautious, but alive. She looked at him for the first time, truly looked, and he felt his heart stutter. Not because of her beauty, but because of what he saw in her gaze. Exhaustion, fear, and something else he couldn't name. "My name," she started, her voice trembling. "My name is Anna." Samuel blinked slowly, trying to take in the sound of it. "Anna," he repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. She nodded again, tears gathering in her eyes but not falling. They made me wear it. Said no one wanted to see what they'd ruined." Her voice cracked, the words spilling like something long locked away. "I was taken from my home, sold, moved from one place to another. The sack kept people from looking, but it also kept me from being seen." Samuel's hands clenched at his sides, not in anger at her, but at the world that had done this to her. He wanted to say something, but no words seemed right. Anna looked back at the fire. "You didn't ask me to take it off," she said quietly. "You didn't try to make me talk." "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he said. His voice was rough but steady. She looked at him again, her lips trembling. "No one's ever waited before." He didn't answer. He simply nodded, and for a long time they sat in silence, the firelight flickering between them. The air in the cabin felt different now, lighter, though the truth she'd spoken hung heavy between them. When she finally looked up again, her eyes met his, and he saw something there that hadn't been there before: trust. Not complete, not unbroken, but real. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the cabin walls like a whisper. Samuel watched her reach for the small carving once more, holding it close. She didn't cover her face again. She didn't need to. For the first time since she'd arrived, he saw her smile, small, hesitant, but true. It flickered in the firelight, fragile yet brighter than anything he'd seen all winter. Samuel didn't speak. He just watched as she sat there, free from the cloth, her name echoing softly in his mind. Anna. The woman he'd bought for $2, and the only soul who had made that lonely cabin feel like home. The days after she spoke her name felt different, quieter but full. The silence they shared no longer carried weight, it breathed. Samuel noticed it first in the way Anna moved around the cabin. Her steps were lighter now, her hands steady when she worked. The sack that had once hung over her head was gone for good, folded and tucked away in a corner as if she'd buried the ghost of her old life with it. Sometimes, when she passed by the window, the sunlight would catch her hair and turn it to copper fire. Samuel found himself watching those moments longer than he should. He tried to keep the days the same, cutting wood, fixing tools, bringing water from the creek, but everything around him seemed to have changed. The forest looked greener, the air softer, the river louder. Even the sound of her humming, the same faint tune she'd once kept hidden, filled the cabin like warmth. He didn't say much about it. He wasn't a man who used words easily. But he began to look forward to every small thing she did, every quiet sound that reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes at night they talked, just little pieces. She told him about her home by the coast, how she used to carve small wooden animals with her father, how her mother sang when the storms came. Her voice was still fragile, but the more she spoke, the stronger it became. Samuel listened, never interrupting. He wanted her to empty every dark thing she'd kept locked away. She told him about the day everything was taken, how a man she trusted sold her when her family was gone, how the sack became her shield and her prison. When she finished, she looked at him with eyes that seemed afraid of pity. "You don't have to keep me," she said softly one evening. "I can go when the road clears." Samuel didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire, the light painting shadows across his face. Finally, he said, "I don't keep people. You stay because you choose to." She didn't respond, but he noticed her shoulders drop slightly, like she had let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. After that, she stayed by the fire longer each night, her chair a little closer to his. The thaw came late that year. When the snow finally melted, the river swelled, breaking through the ice with a rush that filled the valley. Samuel went into town for supplies. He hadn't been back since the auction. People stared when he walked in, but no one mentioned it. They'd heard stories, the kind people whisper when they don't know the truth. He ignored them, bought what he needed, and left quickly. When he returned home, he found Anna outside, sitting on the porch steps. The sun touched her face, her eyes closed as if she was soaking in a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. She looked up when he approached and smiled, a small, easy smile that reached her eyes. "You were gone long," she said. "Town's still loud," he replied. "I'd rather be here." That night after supper she surprised him. She placed something on the table, 2 rings carved from wood. They were simple, uneven, but smooth where her fingers had worked them carefully. "I made these," she said, "for you and me." He looked at them, unsure what to say. "I know you didn't buy me to marry me," she continued, her voice trembling. "But I want to belong somewhere again, and I want to belong with you." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, rough and warm against his. "You already do," he said quietly. The fire crackled. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then, with a small nod, she slid one of the rings onto his finger. He did the same, his big hand shaking slightly as he placed the other on hers. There were no witnesses, no priest, no grand words. Just the sound of wind outside and the quiet heartbeat of 2 people who had found each other in the unlikeliest way. From that day forward, Anna moved through the cabin as if it had always been her home. She filled it with small touches, flowers in jars, curtains made from scraps, carved birds along the window ledge. Samuel built her a garden near the edge of the woods. When the first shoots of green pushed through the soil, she laughed out loud, and he realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It was soft and bright, like a bell carried by wind. They worked side by side through the spring, their lives no longer bound by silence. At night, when the fire burned low, she sometimes rested her head on his shoulder while they watched the flames fade. He'd never imagined a life like this, quiet but full, built not on words or promises but on something stronger: gentleness. One evening, as dusk turned the forest gold, she told him she had something else to show. She took him to the back of the cabin where the trees opened slightly, revealing a small clearing. There, resting on a stump, was a carving, a woman with a bird perched on her shoulder. The detail was delicate, her hands outstretched, her head lifted toward the sky. "She's not hiding anymore," Anna said softly. Samuel looked at the carving, then at her. The woman in wood looked free, alive, like her. He didn't speak, but his eyes told her everything. That summer, people in town stopped whispering about the auction. They spoke instead about the couple who lived deep in the forest, the lumberjack and the quiet woman who sold wooden carvings at the market. Children came to see her birds and flowers, marveling at the way her hands could turn wood into something that seemed to breathe. Samuel didn't go into town much after that. He didn't need to. Everything he'd ever been searching for was there, in the small cabin by the river. Some nights, when the world outside grew dark and the forest hummed with life, he'd sit by the fire and watch her carve. Her face glowed in the light, calm and certain, the faint scar along her jaw catching the flame just so. He'd think about the day he spent $2 on a woman no one wanted, a woman whose face the world had forced to hide. And though he never said it out loud, he knew what those $2 had really bought him. Not ownership, not obligation, but the chance to find love in its truest, simplest form. Anna would look up from her carving sometimes and catch him staring. She'd smile, that same small smile she'd worn on the porch the day he came back from town. "What?" she'd ask. He'd shake his head, chuckling softly. Just thinking, he'd say. And she'd reach over, touch his arm lightly and whisper, "Then don't think too much, Samuel, just stay." And he would, every time.